Well, yes, I'm an economist. Extremely well trained, etc., and capable to be immodest about it. Economists are really. They're very much pragmatic, know-it-all type personalities, and I am of that sort. I know that. It's the ego Mum gave me. Mummy's boy, greatly loved. Bless her. To the point, though. Yes, there will be difficulties with the current situation, and our solutions won't always be right. You know, as I've said, the tariffs might have worked, or might have failed, in fact, really, in the 1930s. It was a different world. And when America decided to close its doors on the rest of the world, well, it recovered. It's a continental market system in itself. There will be shortages. I mean, the modern world, we're worried about rare earth minerals that we need for, well, military and electronic purposes and so on. But, we find substitutes, we are inventive, and for all our armaments, most of them are not used, Most of them are not actually lost in war, they're just lost in redundancy, being superseded by the next technological invention and application. And yes, we've got the situation at the minute where the Chinese have to sell their assets that are anything to do with America because they might be worth nothing tomorrow. If America seizes such assets, whether they be bond market or equity market or, land and businesses and so on that are in America or in some country that's willing to seize them. And that will, yes, in itself, crash the bond prices, raise the long-term sort of rates on US Treasury, make it harder for America to borrow. Okay, so you don't borrow. Well, you need to increase the money supply in your economy. You simply create a balance and spend it. Like the New Deal in America, projects which now only benefit your own people because you've closed the doors on international trade. And yes, other countries struggle along and they'll have their problems and no doubt rearm like the Second World War preparation. And perhaps there'll be another war as a consequence. And perhaps there won't. And perhaps the lot of the man in the street will change haltingly, sometimes in poverty, sometimes in annihilation, like perhaps the Chinese population, suddenly, through pandemics. We think of the people that died after the World Wars, well, from flu, for goodness sake. Why? Because they were so poorly nourished. Our modern world is poorly nourished. You look at the quality of the food now, we've wrecked it compared to real organic food. We've gone into fast food. People with weight problems and starving to death but not looking like it. Starved in the essential things of life. And in some countries, flu, for instance, doesn't kill anyone really much in a few hundred a year, a few thousand a year, depending on the population size and so on. But if they're malnourished, like after the war, then flu can wipe out far more people than were killed in the war. So yes, we will get things wrong as well. We'll make mistakes. But by the grace of God, man is extremely resourceful. And there's always been tomorrow. Perhaps there hasn't. Perhaps there have been many civilizations that have come and gone. I think materially, this has been an unusual one, modern world, in being such prosperity for so many. In the West, you could say, well, the middle class. In communist countries, you could say for the elite, it's not so many. You know, I mean, a place like China, I don't know, 100, 150 million have done very well. But what's that, 10% of a possible population? You're not sure. And nobody can trust the figures anyway. You know, there could be at 1.4 billion, 1.4 billion people in China. And then even the government think perhaps there's a few 100 million less than that. And then people on the outside looking at the consumption of the country and anything from internet calls and so on, and they come to the conclusion it could be as low as 350 million. You know, a third of what you expect. You don't know. Are they suffering? Are they dying? There's phenomenal queues in hospitals and mortuaries. Or are they still the powerhouse of the world? Only if the West buys their goods. You see, it's an integrated world that's brought its prosperity through more or less keeping the rules and trade. We found that floating exchange rates greatly helped. We were worried about speculation. And certainly some people made a great deal of money in speculation and seemed to cause instability. So perhaps you needed government intervention. And you're not quite sure how much and what's best. You say, well, your science of economics then is not very developed, not very good. No, you're right. It's like science of our medical sciences, mental illness and so on. You know, especially what it's moved into, like mental illnesses. No, we don't understand. We're still finding out. We have hopes that we will conquer, will come to a greater understanding and therefore more able to achieve good purposes if we have them. And sometimes we're greatly handicapped by our political and economic systems that don't allow us to move in the right direction always. So we get pressure for change, and then there's the fear of, revolution and wars and strife in order to change systems that seem so rigid. And sometimes only change through catastrophes that in hindsight, have blessings for those that are left, of course. Yeah. But perhaps for those that died too. Perhaps they learned something of a greater value that qualifies them for heaven. for life eternal. We quite simply do not know. But what we choose to believe incredibly influences what we do and what we achieve. So successful living becomes, in part at least, something to do with our attitude of mind, our volition, willingness to do things, our spontaneity, our creativity. All sort of turns on our beliefs and values, hopes and desires. And yes, understanding as well. And sometimes our understanding wrongly that resulted in decisions that, great cost. Sometimes great benefits as well. I mean, at the same time. And from this seeming chaos of not knowing, of childish behaviour, really, isn't it, in a sense, we grow up. But perhaps we don't grow up to a maturity here in this world, but rather in the sense of graduation to another. And of course all sorts of religious views are of this type of character, aren't they? That their response has been to the woes and troubles of this world to imagine and hope for it in some sense being meaningful in terms of another. And I might say, in doing that, in following such things, all major world religions, in some ways it has made some people much happier and harmonious, much more so in this world than if they did not have such hopes and expectations. And has made some people much more saintly too. Wonderful. Of course, there's been an awful downside too. I mean, hypocrisy and awful abuses of power and position in themselves, elite groups with hierarchies and the usual evils that go with organisations and public life. As you know, I am fascinated by the Jesus story, not because I own that it's the perfect word of God or something, but on the contrary, I own it as an amazing breakthrough in contrast to, in many ways, the way religious life has gone for so many people on the planet. It's been so bad. Much of our salvation in modern improvements in, perhaps what we see in the West, perhaps, but of human rights and care and medical help and education and pensions and unemployment pay and socialism, in other words. Well, in some countries, like in 19th century England, much pushed by evangelical religion. In others, not. It's been pushed by, even in Europe, something like theosophy that so championed women's rights and so on, whilst the church was championing children's rights and anti-slavery and so forth. people from quite opposite persuasions can all be in the mix of rescuing society from its perils. Even the professional economist who says, oh, well, it wasn't necessarily plain sailing when we did this last time. If we do it, perhaps we need to do it slightly differently, make all the difference in the world to the outcome. Yeah. So we have social scientists now, and the social sciences are far more demanding than the physical sciences, in the sense that, well, it's very hard to experiment with people, and those that do, like perhaps some of the other nations of the world, get a very bad name for experimenting with their own population or with those of neighbouring states. And so the science is in its infancy, whether it's sociology or psychology or economics or even business studies, is very poorly understood, isn't it? And there's very little meeting of minds between these specialisms and between, of course, physical and social sciences. Still, there's a goal. Because the nature of the world in which they work is so different. I think that's part of it anyway. And when it comes to the gulf between rational thought in what we call sciences and what we call the spiritual understanding of things, which includes religion more or less in some ways, well, there's an even bigger goal. The worldling thinks that the spiritual are away with the fairies, and the spiritual think that the world is desperately astray in not understanding the spiritual. There are major divisions in our society, not just in terms of wealth and standard of living, and of course still in education in reality. You know, a doctorate in basket weaving is not the same as a doctorate in mathematics. It just isn't. Baskets are very useful, don't get me wrong. But rational thought is incredibly useful too. And risky, because we are so heady. Like, as I said at the beginning of this recording, our scientists, our experts, economists and, you know, business professors and political scientists and sociologists and medical people and physicists and astronomers and chemists and infinite number of specialisms, all of which are, well, so well respected within their own discipline, and desperately trying to understand the others, but unfortunately there's a language difference. Everyone's got their own jargon and way of, well, even thinking, really, what they think of as rational and what they don't. And the problems facing each discipline are of an amazing multitude in a world and a system that is utterly interrelated in everything. Everything affects everything else. Everything's a consequence of causes and conditions that are outside our individual understanding. And we pontificate on what the answer should be and what the future will be if we keep going the way we're going. And threats of hell, hopes of paradise. But one thing is certain, this life flies. One thing is certain and the rest is lies. The flower that once has bloomed forever dies. How do you reconcile yourself to this finality, doom as it seems? You know, is awayc here the great prophet of unavoidable doom? Or is he saying there's something beyond? And that's where the spiritual comes in, and there's, like Paramahansa did a huge volume on the meaning of awayc, and perhaps others have as well, I don't know. But it's a bit like commentaries on all the scriptures of the world, and they're endless. In a way they're full of hope, and in a way they're full of, because of distress and despair and doom, as so many have experienced it in the material world. Jesus' story is, I am come that you might have life and have it more abundantly, and life eternal. Read John 17. If you find it inspiring, then you may find it's the greatest, happiest thing you've ever come across, and maybe into eternity too. And even if it's just a lotto ticket, do you know the poor are very rational? They know that they can't win lotto if they don't buy a ticket at least occasionally. Of course, it's best to stick to being occasional. If it becomes obsessional, then you live in poverty just because of too many lotto tickets. Too much horse racing or too much gambling on stock market, whatever. So there's some sort of optimal, sort of low level that's worthwhile. And now and again we make quite big level decisions. I mean, I migrated to New Zealand from England. You could say, well, that was very cautious. In some ways it was English speaking and English history in a way in New Zealand, and known to be a safe country and a warmer climate. And yeah, well, I agree. Seemed a big move for me though. And it was an extremely prosperous one. And sometimes migrants have a great deal of trouble. But then I moved to a society that valued the occupation I was specialised in, so it wasn't too irrational, was it? Not too risky. And I did reason, well, I could always go home again if it all turns to custard. But home wasn't that inviting either at the time. And we were concerned about nuclear power everywhere around us. Was it 3 nuclear power stations within 20 miles and a 4th fast breeder reactor being built? And you never know when there's the so-called minor problems at the nuclear plant that 40 years later you realise why the kids are born deformed and so on. There are problems wherever you are in the world. There are, but you can find better and worse places to live in. And if you have a trust in God, you can make very large moves, but be wise as well. I don't mean recklessly a trust in God. I mean a rational trust in God. My key rationality is, well, if heaven is infinite, life eternal for you, it's worth more than anything here now, isn't it? However, it might not be on the cards a possibility at all. So don't be too reckless in, burning your boats and destroying your bridges or whatever so that you can't recover if you need. But to love God with all your heart and soul, when it's your God that personifies your values, well, really, what else could you love? By definition. I won't say trust me, but practice thanking God for all that's good and lovely, and being aware of all that's good and lovely. And if you want a miraculous life, you might take a few gambles, in particular in thanking God for all the minor things that are wrong. And you may find they're transformed, or your view of them, transformed into blessing. And you surge forward on a wave of, well, what you see as God's miraculous power and love of you and actually all his creation. It's just that we're children. We are not masters of the show. I have, a master's in economics and allowed me to lecture at uni and teach children, and most of my life have a very good standard of living. Pretty low now, but still worlds apart from what many are suffering from in the world. And I know it. And I thank God for his love and care. What about his care of them, you might say? Oh, I trust to goodness that he loves them all. Because I do. How could my God be different? That would be a nonsense. Love you, Heavenly Dad. Thank you, Dad.